Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. James Darnborough, thank you so much for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. I cannot thank you enough. I'm literally interviewing the Renaissance man, and I'm so excited to have you on. And I'm so excited for our time together. Thank you again for being here.
Oh, thanks, Mike. It's a real pleasure to join you today.
So like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story and our passion is to help them tell it. And what we know is people that listen to your story, there are unique things about your story that they'll connect with, similarities that they've had through their lives, and it'll inspire and motivate them to go out and do things that they've been putting off. And that's exactly what we're all about. So with your permission, we're going to start with where you were born, and we'll go all the way up to today. And then we can talk about anything that you want to talk about today that you're working on. It's probably 19 different projects. So we'll talk about that when we get there, okay?
Okay, sounds great.
All right, buddy. So where were you born?
I was born in London, in England, on a very rainy Saturday morning.
There you go. It's rainy here.
Yeah. almost immediately, I knew I wanted to live somewhere warmer.
Yeah.
No, I grew up in the UK. I'm a product of a British boarding school, which means I don't understand how to describe emotions.
Right.
And but I typical English lad, played rugby at school, and I had a really fun time. I was in the Army Cadets from age 14, so I learned how to drive a tank before I could drive a car, and jumped out of a plane when I was 16. And I was really lucky. You know, I'm an only child, which meant that I could just run off into the woods and hide and build camps, and no one would really mind.
Love it. I love it. So in high school, did you have a favorite subject?
Probably English literature.
Yeah.
And I loved acting.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the UK, obviously, we learn about Shakespeare and Milton and, the classic literature. So the curriculum hasn't really changed in 200 years. Yeah. But I was quite happy with that. I think I was never really good at maths. I was never really that excited about science, but I loved history and literature.
I think you alluded to this already, but what was your favorite thing about growing up where you grew up in London?
Well, my parents lived in London, but I was kind of in the country from about 7 years old.
Okay.
London itself was a really exciting place. I mean, I'm going back quite a while now, so
Right.
Late 70s,
Right.
when the Rolling Stones, when punk on the King's Road, and that it was, you know, the people who were a generation behind us thought we were absolute terrorists, the way that we behaved and dressed and the music that we listened to and everything else, because they were from the sort of Frank Sinatra age, and you know, we were into the Clash and the Jam and David Bowie and
love that music,
all that. So music, funnily enough, music kind of defined the age, didn't it? So that played a big part in my life. Now that I think about it.
That's cool, man. I love all that music. So still do today. So after high school, where do you go?
Well, a lot of my friends were going to university, and they didn't really seem, as far as I was concerned, to have a lot of purpose. So I have a friend who studied zoology, and he has no idea why he did it. He went to this university because he was a good rower. And I was literally sitting in the pub with a friend one day, and I said, you know, we need to go and live somewhere hot. What are we going to do? Let's get out of here. And so I came up with a plan to produce a magazine for the South African Professional Golfers Association. So I'm 19 years old, and we went down there to Johannesburg, and I said, right, I'll make you a magazine. It'll look like Vogue, but we'll have Ernie Els on the front, or some wonderful golfer like that. And we'll send it free to all your members. And they said, well, that's just amazing. How much will it cost us? Nothing. But I get to keep all the advertising revenue.
Right.
And we get to call it the official PGA magazine of South Africa. And so we did that. And it was a hit because this was the days before the internet.
Right.
And so everybody used to read magazines then. That was how you consumed information and learned about, you know, in this case, how to become a better golfer and, you know, aspire to go to all these exotic places. There was a lot of travel and stuff like that involved. And then we just carried on going. We ended up, this was really the highlight. So I lived in South Africa for 7 years, and I saw Mandela being released and the end of apartheid. It was the most exciting time to be there.
Yeah.
The Rugby World Cup, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know the film Invictus, which is where Mandela, South Africa won the Rugby World Cup at home. I mean, it was just extraordinary. 2 billion people were watching it, and I was in the stadium, and I'd done a magazine for the Rugby World Cup in order that I could get invited to all the VIP things in all the different venues and cities. But that moment when he handed the World Cup to Francois Pienaar, the captain, that's when we knew South Africa really had changed and become the rainbow nation, because they were dancing in the streets. We had no idea so many people were watching it. 2 billion people watched it. There can't have been that many televisions in the world.
Yeah.
So,
well, it just, I mean, that was such an amazing time. Like you said, that entire political system got turned on its head. And to be there and be a part of that is just, that's just got to be something that you cherish for the rest of your life.
I know. And, you know, just by luck, I mean, you know, right place, right time.
Yeah.
And I think showing up, I mean, that's something I was taught very early on is, you know, you've got to show up to these things or they'll just pass you by. But it was an amazing time because the Soviet Union collapsed. It was the first Gulf War, obviously, and Berlin Wall came down, and Mandela was released, and it was an amazing thing to witness.
It was like an awakening. It was just incredible.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful country with beautiful people, and so I was very happy to be there. But
I have some friends from
after that, though, it was time to move on. I felt like, okay, it's not going to get better than this. What's next?
We've peaked here, right? So I've got some friends from South Africa. They're amazing. And I'm a huge Ernie Els fan. So is my wife.
Right.
So yeah, that's awesome, man. So after South Africa, where do you go?
Well, I went back to England,
Okay.
and I hated it. You know, I was going to work on the Underground every day, and, you know, summer passed by very quickly, as it does. And I did super screens, which were like rear projection giant screens with a squillion pixels. And it was the first time that you could see the screen outside. So, for example, there was one at the Melbourne Grand Prix at Formula One. It doesn't matter if it's raining or direct sunlight on the screen. So I put 4 of those up in Piccadilly Circus in London, in the old Tower Records building. Tower Records and Lily White's, and then I did one in France, and then some at the Olympic Village in Sydney. And I flew all the way to Sydney for 2 days from London. I know, isn't it crazy? I went back a few years later, but to meet the Olympic Committee, and you know that was fun. But I just really wasn't happy because I was in London, and you know, I know everybody wants to go to London. The difference between visiting London and living and working there is
dramatic.
Like probably most cities. You
Yeah,
know, become quite a grind after a while. And I realized that, you know, I really wanted to get a note from the doctor saying this guy can only live in sunny, warm places.
Well, it had to have been, aside from the change in weather, it had to have been a real change in pace, because you know, South Africa doesn't move as fast as London does. There's very few places in the world that move that quickly, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, South Africa, they just invented the fax machine.
Yeah.
And you know, in London, suddenly it was the internet revolution, the digital revolution, completely. Everything changed. We didn't have iPhones quite, but we had mobile phones or cell phones. But yeah, and that's when, you're right, everything picked up pace very, very rapidly. And it was, again, I mean, it was pretty exciting time. But nevertheless, it was just this sort of the Germans call it Wanderlust, where you have this inability to stay in one place for any considerable amount of time.
Yeah.
And so the next place on my journey was back to Australia.
Oh wow. Okay. So why Australia?
Oh, because it's hot and sunny.
There you go. That works.
Yes, I went to Sydney. So this is the second time I immigrated. I went to Sydney for 3 months, and I thought, what's the point of moving all the way to Australia just to live in a city? Right. I mean, this is a place that's as big as the USA.
Yeah.
So I went to Western Australia.
Okay.
And this is a state that that's like moving from New York to LA, just to give you an idea of the size. Yeah. But the state of Western Australia, you can fit the whole of Europe inside it, and there's only 1.2 million people live there, and they practically all know each other. So that was extraordinary because, I mean, talk about being far away from everything. It's the most remote city in the world is Perth in Western Australia. Bali is closer than Sydney. But, you drive north from Perth, you can drive 1,000 miles north and see some trucks. But then they have a place called Coral Bay, which is like the Great Barrier Reef, but without the tourists. And there's no buildings there. You've got to camp, and you swim with reef sharks and turtles and manta rays. And I know it's absolutely amazing. And they're very serious about protecting it. That whole coastline is marine protectorate, which means you're not allowed to water ski. You can't even scuba dive for 1,000 miles. Wow. So it's pristine and just untouched and unspoiled. And I hope it stays that way. The Australians they're really good about that. Australians and Californians are really serious about protecting the environment. And it's wonderful to see it. Yeah. So I stayed there for 4 years, and then I stayed in the media business, but not in publishing. I got into recruitment, so I was recruiting senior media people, and so trying to convince people to move from Sydney with their families and their kids and completely relocate to Perth, which
change of pace.
Exactly at the time, it wasn't exactly a bustling centre of commerce,
right?
But I think that's what people craved. They wanted a different pace of life. To slow down and play golf on Wednesday afternoon and no one cares, and go surfing and all that.
Yeah,
so that was
like,
right. And
so after Australia, where do you go?
I'm sorry.
After Australia, where do you go?
Oh, after Australia, back to London for a bit. Then I went to Cape Town, South Africa for a bit, and I was going to do a digital magazine for the rugby in South Africa. And then what happened is I decided to look up an old girlfriend, and I feel quite bad about this because I practically stalked her on LinkedIn.
Oh.
And we hadn't seen each other since we were kids. We were teenagers, and I found her on LinkedIn, and she's American, but she's from LA. But she grew up in London, so she's American but with a British accent. Anyway, so I messaged her and I said, I'm in London. Would you like to meet for lunch? And she said no. And I, okay, well, I'm not going to give up. I'm not giving up that easily. And she said, I'm happy. I've just written a book. I'm going to be famous. I've got a really nice apartment in Chelsea. And leave me alone. And anyway, we went for lunch. And a year and a half later, we got married and moved to Los Angeles. So.
Oh, good for you, man. That's awesome. So that's what brought you to California, to the U.S.
Oh, yeah, completely. I'd love to take the credit and say that was the most intelligent decision I've made in my life, because I feel this is about 10, 11 years ago. I feel like I graduated to California, but it was because of her and her family connections and everything that I got here, and that I got to stay here, because immigrating to the States is pretty hard. I mean, South Africa is easy. Australia is really hard unless you're a policeman or a teacher or a hairdresser. That's what they need. But California, getting to the States, even though I'm quarter American, my grandfather was American.
Okay.
But the immigration don't care about things like that.
Yeah. No, I got you. So you come to California.
Yeah.
And It sounds so you did some charity work. There was a wildfire. You did some charity work, Montecito area.
Yeah.
I saw that. Talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about what it was like when you got here.
Getting involved in events is the best thing to do because not everyone can, join all the clubs and stuff. So I I don't know. I thought, well, first of all, of course, I wanted to publish more magazines, and
Right.
my wife forbade me eventually. She said that's ridiculous. People don't read magazines anymore. Just stop it.
Right.
So I went and got. I wanted to get into property like you, so I went and got my real estate license, and I worked for Coldwell Banker in Montecito because I thought I'm going to sell houses to Ellen DeGeneres and Oprah Winfrey. Of course I am.
There you go.
And
You do to this day, right? You're still with Coldwell Banker.
I'm still a licensed realtor. It's very useful, actually. It's very, very useful. I don't practice day to day as I did, but it's incredibly useful because now I have no fear, and there's the confidence that you get from actually having, being licensed and doing the knowledge and redoing the exams. And I mean, my gosh, we have to learn about cybersecurity and wire fraud and all kinds of legal things now. It's not just about, isn't this a nice house?
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, I got involved in all kinds of things. I did an event at the Granada Theatre in Santa Barbara for 1,000 people, and it was about women in the environment. And so here's this foreigner guy organizing. I think I had 75 panelists, 12 moderators, and because I realized that all the great environmental non-profits were actually run by women, and at least the good ones, because they're really good at raising money and they're really good at understanding what should be top of the list of priorities, like water management is a big one, marine conservation. Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter runs the marine conservation thing up in Santa Barbara, and all these amazing people. So I got them all together, and the idea was I wanted to get them to work together, to collaborate, because a place like Santa Barbara is full of nonprofits. They have the world record for nonprofits, but not enough of them work together.
Right.
So they need to pool their resources, and they all fundraise from the same people when they could just work together. And so we gave them incentive to do that, and it was pretty successful. And that's how you meet people.
Absolutely.
Doing things like that. And I met a ton of people and joined Toastmasters, which is all about public speaking. And I loved Toastmasters, and I ran 5 clubs there. And I don't know. I mean, Santa Barbara is just one of those incredible places where people do tend to know each other, more so than if you're in a big city. You know how they say you can be really lonely in a big city, especially if you just arrived. Well, I was lucky enough to be in Santa Barbara. It wasn't supposed to be there. We went up. We thought we'd stay for maybe 2 months, and we stayed for 7 years.
Amazing how that works. I could Santa Barbara for the rest of my life. I absolutely love it there. It's one of my favorite places on the planet.
Yeah.
So it's really, I can understand. I totally.
I mean, every day I'd look up at the mountains and the ocean and just think, how did I get here?
Yeah.
How did this happen? And I still do. I can't believe it. Now I drive around Hollywood and think this is just ridiculous. How did I get here? The only people who live here are Hollywood stars and directors. Well, I feel like an imposter sometimes, but it's wonderful to be in California. I'm very, very grateful, very lucky.
So I have a quick question on a selfish note. Have you ever been to the Sacred Garden?
I don't think so.
That's okay. It's just south of Santa Barbara. I forget the name of it. Summerhill, I think, is the.
Oh, Summerland.
Summerland. So.
Oh, yes, I have. I know exactly the Sacred Garden.
It's in Summerland. It is so cool. And the guy who owns it is so connected. I'm sure you know each other. He's so connected in Santa Barbara and in entertainment and the whole thing. I mean, there's photos of all kinds of famous people around the store and that kind of thing. And it's one of my favorite places on the planet. So that's the only reason I was asking.
Well, it's wonderful, isn't it? Because it's just on the corner there. It looks very nondescript. It looks like there's maybe a husband and a wife who are thrown over from the 70s who are inside there selling trinkets and candles, and you go in. And then you carry on going, and there's this magnificent garden, and it's kind of Japanese Californian, the garden, and that's really funny. I love that. I love Summerland actually. It's Summerland is like, a lot of Australian tiny little towns, with one road going through it, and all the shops are run by people. It's their own, little artisans, their own shops. They make stuff, and
it's just charming as all get out, and it's just the coolest place. It's got the best vibe, right? And I walked in there, and I'm not into that stuff typically, right? But I walked in there and I got a feeling that I've never been able to replicate. I guess it's Zen. I don't know exactly, right? It's just the feeling and the atmosphere there is just amazing. And so I've been back a couple of times since the first time, and every time we go back to that area, I have to go there. So it's really cool, really cool. Yeah. Anyway, so you moved from Santa Barbara to Los Angeles to Hollywood.
Yeah, during COVID.
Yeah,
I mean, everyone has this sort of pre-post COVID story at the moment, and it feels like time stood still. We were in Santa Barbara for a bit, and it was great fun, taking care of our neighbors who are quite elderly. So we would bring them food and of course the obligatory toilet paper. Everyone's got a toilet paper story.
Nothing like collaborating, right?
Right, exactly. So I mean, but that was nice. It was nice to be able to be useful rather than just curling up in a ball. And then the funniest thing happened. So I got an email from a guy in England who's American, and he was researching US Air Force bases in southern England during the Second World War. And my father was a film producer, and he'd made a film in 1952 called Highly Dangerous. And so this guy was asking me, my father passed away a long time ago, and he was asking me if I knew anything else about the location, because it was what's now RAF Northolt. And I said, I'm really sorry, I don't know anything more, because what you've got on the internet is all I've got as well. And then anyway, then we got to know each other, and we exchanged a couple of emails, and it was all very nice. And then one day an email arrived, and it goes, it was a very...
We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out Calendly.com/Rio760.